Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. Socrates once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And if you spend a little bit of time watching The Social Dilemma on Netflix, you would probably come to a very similar conclusion as Socrates. When they say that about 74% of Americans are not convinced that their data is being used in line with privacy standards from private companies, and maybe 64% say that so is the case with government entities and how they use your data, you know that there is a sense of unease, distrust, but in many cases also a sense of ignorance of folks not quite knowing what's happening with their data. Could you say ignorance is bliss? I don't quite think so. And I think my guest today is going to allow us to reflect on what we need to know about privacy. Let me take the next 15 seconds to orient you a little bit further about how far your data online can actually go. I grew up in the Middle East, specifically in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. And in and around me, late like 2009 to 2011, there was something called the Arab Spring. Take some time to read about how ideas were formulated online, how the revolution was crowdsourced, but then take a step into how groups of dissident thinkers were targeted online, how their activities were tracked, how that was used against them, not only to physically ambush them, but also legally, socially, and digitally. My guest today is someone that is no stranger to the world of data. She's called the Data Diva. She's been featured on numerous impressive journals and impressive newspapers and publications. You know, they say that even the strongest blizzard begins with one drop of a snowflake. And I think what you're going to learn today is about the little steps that you can take to enhance your privacy. Please join me in welcoming the Data Diva herself, Debbie Reynolds. Debbie, welcome to the Power Hour.
Thank you so much. That was great. I love Socrates, so that was great. I love that.
Well, I'm glad we're off. We've taken off on the right foot, and we'll jump right into this. Debbie, along with introducing yourself just a little bit, can you explain to us this notion of how privacy, and I shudder when I use this term, but how privacy can be weaponized against a community? Debbie?
Great question. So I'm Debbie Reynolds. I run Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I work with companies that have some multinational dimension to their product offering. So whether they are expanding to different markets or trying to pivot or get over barriers to adoption. I also work with companies on, venture capital, private equity deals, and also just data privacy work in terms of being a data privacy officer for companies around the world. Um, so your question was about weaponizing data privacy. You
Yeah.
ask it one more time.
How can privacy be weaponized? If someone has data about you in a certain way, how can that be used against you?
Well, yeah. So privacy can be weaponized and people can use things against you. I think having too much data out there to be analyzed can lead to inferences that may not be true and may be harmful to you. So, one example I gave recently is about a situation in the US, and I'm sure this happens in other countries too, where law enforcement can send to search engines warrants that aren't targeted to an individual. They're targeted to, let's say, a radius of certain number of blocks, say, or based on like a search word that you use, and those names go to law enforcement. And as you know, just because you search for a certain word on the internet or because you happen to be in a certain vicinity doesn't make you a suspect in a crime or anything like that.
Yeah.
But there's just a danger of gathering too much information and having those inferences be made that may harm you.
Yeah. So ultimately, it's a piece of knowledge that sits in the hands of the beholder, and how it's used, it's a tool. It can be used to construct and destruct. I want to take this a little step further, and that is often when I find myself discussing privacy issues, much like in security, it's often excessive until it's not. What are some good steps that individuals can take if you had to orient 3 steps to how we engage ourselves digitally to ensure that we're protecting our privacy to some extent.
Well, I highly recommend if you're in room, like, so a lot of people are working from home right now.
Yeah.
If you're in rooms and you're talking about business information or confidential information, you should not have smart speakers in the room. Turn them off or don't have them connected in those rooms, because anything that goes into those speakers can be, you don't have any control over what happens to that information. Also, let's say you're walking around town. I know a lot of us have Bluetooth enabled on our phones, but if you're not actually using it, you probably shouldn't have it on. So that's something I highly recommend people not do. I'm guilty of that too. So, like, let's say you have your phone in the car and you have it connected and you're listening to your music. But once you get out of the car, you may not actually need Bluetooth, but other devices can track you because you have Bluetooth on. And especially if you don't need it, it's a good idea to turn it off.
Yeah. And I think this aspect points to something that's extremely important is yes, we are reliant on what application providers such as Facebook, such as Twitter, such as any other application that's out there, we are reliant on what their terms of use are and what their privacy policies are. But as individual users, a relative amount of power rests in our hands. And this is where I want to talk to you about when do we actually sacrifice some of our privacy. Let's go to a recent article that you shared. I don't quite remember the source of it, but it is definitely on your website, where you spoke about this idea of that in today's quote unquote new normal, employees and employers are having to share information about health records. Where have you been? Have you fallen sick? So on and so forth. And you mentioned a lot of caution in that because when I look at it at the surface level, hey, I'm just letting you know that I traveled out of the country and now I have to quarantine for 14 days. But you flag a couple of flags of caution there saying that data can be misused in a certain way. Can you shed some light on how that kind of COVID related data can be misused?
Yeah. Especially, I mean, I don't, I think it's a bit different. I think anyone should be cautious, right? But I think it's a little bit different in the US. So, the US, we have a private healthcare system and not a public one. That means that, if you're in a country, like a lot of countries where they have universal healthcare, you can't be tossed off of healthcare. Where in the US, you can. So, let's say, uh, you know, uh, you're saying, okay, I had COVID, or someone in my family had COVID, that may eventually end up being like a pre-existing condition. And depending on how the laws are happening in the US, you may be denied insurance in the future. Let's say you change jobs, because when in the US, if you change jobs or you lose a job, you also lose your insurance basically. So you have to go on to a different insurance plan. You may be denied because it's considered like a pre-existing condition. Also, if you're voluntarily giving up medical information about yourself outside of a medical setting, it doesn't have the same privacy protections. So, that's what my concern about things like contact tracing apps, especially if they're not done within the walls of medical professionals. So in the US, we have a HIPAA law that has a privacy standard, and it's about patient and provider privacy. But once you're out of that setting and you're sharing health data outside that setting, it has only consumer protections. And if it was an employer employee relationship, it even has less protection for the employee, because having an employer kind of trumps everything. So I think people don't understand that. People think, oh, because of my health information is protected. It's like, no, it's only protected in that health setting.
Yep, makes sense. And I want to pick on this just a little bit more, if you'd allow me. A teacher of mine once said, read for what's not written, listen for what's not said. In this relationship, if I may take that Socratic pulse and say there is a contractual understanding between you and I, let's say, Debbie, you, for whatever reason, chose to hire me and I was working with you. There is a contract, both explicit and implicit, that I must share certain pieces of information with you. And I am aware of how you are collecting that information. But in another recent article, you made mention of data beacons, which are sitting all around different areas, malls, plazas, spaces where social distancing has to be followed, at least here in Canada, I'm not so sure about how things are rolling out in the US, but we'll leave that as a subject altogether. But what I do want to know is, what about these moments when you're not really sure that someone's collecting information or not? Talk to us a little bit about what are these data beacons and what does it mean for privacy in our hyper digitized landscape?
Sure. So data beacons are capabilities. Beacons were initially created for things like email and marketing. So just like you do an email kind of campaign and you get statistics back to say this person opened an email and this person didn't open an email. That's what beacons can do in emails. So they're invisible gifts that get sent with emails and they sort of report back to the sender information about something. But digital beacons now are being used in a lot of different ways. So, and Bluetooth is one of the main ways the beacons are getting used, like in stores, when you're walking around in public. This is another reason why I say if you're not using Bluetooth, you should turn it off because that's a major way the beacons communicate with your phone. So if you, let's say you're walking in the store knows that you spent 2 minutes in the frozen food aisle or whatever, or whether you're inside the store, outside the store. You know, I've seen people walk past banks and there are beacons, like hackers do this all the time, where they have a beacon installed somewhere close to a bank and then they'll send you a text and say, you know, there's something wrong with your account because they're assuming that you bank there. You may not. So the problem with beacons is that they're very insidious. A lot of times when we're talking about cookie laws, cookies are not beacons. So beacons are much has have more reach and are much more pervasive than cookies. Even though we have a lot of laws about cookies, we don't have anything about beacons. And I think Facebook is buying that
Yep.
Giphy is a beacon. Giphy gifts are beacons. Okay, so when you send the funny pictures around to people on the internet, those are reporting back to the sender, like who's reading it and stuff like that. So it's concerning because people don't understand that these things are tracking kind of you and what you're doing with things, and nefarious actors know how to use these really well as well.
And if the alarms and the sirens behind you are any indication, that that is a sign someone's always listening and someone with authority could use that information in a certain way. I'm going to weave in, and this is a little early and different from my traditional style, but I have a question here that's poking at the fact that I referenced the social dilemma very early on. And I'm going to weave that question in right now. I'm sure if you watch the documentary or the series on Netflix, there's a line in it, and I don't quite remember who said it, where they said it's quite surprising that, and it's metaphorical, that 50 designers in the world can now impact the lives of 2 billion users across the world and across the universe, which renders an important question. And that is, who's responsible for the privacy by design in some of these IoT elements that we have literally scattered all over our homes, all over our streets, and more importantly, all over the buildings where we think we're even behind closed doors. A little bit on who's responsible for that privacy by design, Debbie.
That's a good question. So, who should be responsible for the privacy by design are the makers of these products. However, that's not the case. And I think I had a conversation with someone about this yesterday. So, the makers, they're in the business of making money.
Yep.
So they want to create a product that they can get to you and get in your hands. And then you, as a consumer or a business, you have to be responsible for the ethical use of that product. Even though kind of the default settings are, you know, what they want. And obviously they want to be able to, if they can, have you agree to collect as much information as possible. So it's very problematic because, you know, not everyone is a head of IT or cybersecurity and knows the best way to protect, your privacy when you're using these types of things. So I think it puts a big burden on the individual or the company when they're implementing these things. And it's very problematic because a lot of us assume that it's doing, we assume that it's doing less harm than it actually is doing. And that only, the problem is you wouldn't know until you are harmed in some way. So there, an example of this I saw on the internet yesterday that some company somehow they released like 3 terabytes of video footage from people's, smart camera, recording things in your home or whatever from like IoT devices. And a lot of people when they use these devices, they think they're secure. They think it's just my family looking at it, but really a lot of times the networks aren't secure. People can I tell people don't put smart speakers in their kids' rooms because
Yep.
people can log into that and actually talk to your children, and you don't know what they're saying and things like that. So I think once people are more aware of what the harms are, I think that they can make more educated decisions about how they use these devices.
Yep. And I think that's the key here, right? Is there's an onus of responsibility that we leave on the manufacturers, but there's also an onus of responsibility on us as users. As one speaker once put it on the Power Hour, is some know everything that's true, and some people are just true to what they know. And you need to be true to what you know. If you know a particular device has the capacity to cause some harm, it's up to you to do that risk evaluation and then know how to mitigate against that. And I think those simple steps like moving an IoT device from your home space to a space which is less invasive is probably the way to go. So thank you for that, Debbie. And I'm going to take in another question that, and again, not true to my regular form, but I'll weave it in again because I think it really has a very good sort of flag post for us to stop at and pause for a moment. And this is this aspect of you heard this all the time. I have nothing to hide. There's no issue about, you can know everything about me. But I've often countered that and saying, yeah, you have nothing to hide because there's certain things about yourself that you probably don't even know. A good example of this is many people often say, hey, I have a Facebook account, but I never logged in. Well, guess what, buddy? That silence is also a data point, and that can be used to market at you the fact that, hey, you haven't signed on to Facebook, you need to sign on. Many different things that we do online leave a footprint. How do you deal with this issue of the right to be forgotten? You're aware something has happened, you're aware it's been tracked, you have a right to say you want something removed. How do we navigate that, especially in today's climate?
That's a good question. In the US, we don't necessarily have what's called a right to be forgotten. We do have under CCPA that people can ask for certain data about themselves to be deleted, but that only goes so far. So I think the EU and other countries that are pushing a right to be forgotten is very important because there are certain things that could possibly harm you down the line. Let's say you were in college and you were like you had some drinking party, you had this keg and you think it was a funny picture, but like a couple years down the line you try to have a job and they won't even interview you because they saw this picture of you with a keg. I always tell that to my nieces and nephew. Also, there was a I read the whistleblowers
Yep,
testimony for Cambridge Analytica,
yep,
and the guy he said they had worked on something called the Kit Kat project.
yep,
So the Kit Kat project was basically them taking all this information from Facebook from individuals. They created all these psychological profiles, and then they started retargeting people with ads, trying to sort of divide them in terms of how they voted or not voted. So what they did was they sent some anti-Semitic ads, and anyone who hit thumbs up on that ad, they also in their data collection found that those people also like Kit Kat bars. So if you look at the data, does that mean that eating a Kit Kat bar makes you an anti-Semite? Or how does this information get
one
disseminated? So
way.
does this if you have an employer, does that mean that you are not hireable or you don't have insurance? It's just so many questions about what happens or what inferences that are made in data that may not be true about you as an individual.
Yep. And again, this is one of those things, right? So I work at the intersection of both AI and security. And one of the fundamental aspects that we talk about is that with the growth of AI, I actually would posit that it necessitates the growth of more increased human intelligence and more increased human involvement because somebody has to validate, somebody has to go through that process of assessing the bias, so on and so forth. And again, when we're such a data rich society, we can be data rich but insight poor. In fact, That's where I think the weaponization takes place. So, Debbie, thank you for fielding those two questions and sort of taking a little bit of a detour on our narrative, but we'll sort of come back to where we were. And I just want to give a shout out to the CyberX team for making my lunchtime really easy. I have questions coming in from LinkedIn and the Cyber Exchange portal and Twitter, and I'll do my best, everyone, to get to it. What I can tell you is that if you are on www.cyberexchange.ca, Debbie is on there, so you can post on the wall and ask her a question. You can message her directly, and she'll also be a part of the CISO forum. Now, coming back to sort of the track that we were on, and I expected this to happen. Some of the questions that I crowdsourced went to this aspect of talk to Debbie a little bit about the core differentiations between the US, for example, and the European Union. And I'm assuming this has a lot to do with the aspects of GDPR and what you have in the US. How much is our legal stance on privacy influenced by culture, influenced by different strands of political thought? Can you comment on that a little, Debbie?
Oh, very much. So, two very important differences here. The US and the EU have had a very different trajectory towards where they are and their privacy stances. I would say probably for the EU, a lot of that is built in sort of Nazi Germany and what was done to sort of weaponize data at that time or information about individuals that resulted in the death of many millions of people. And then in the US, we had 9/11. So I think both countries or nations had decided at some point that surveillance or being able to take information about individuals or gather information what could be harmful, but they both took a very opposite view on how to handle that. So because of 9/11, we had the Patriot Act that passed like a couple months after that, which meant that the government had a lot more power to do surveillance, where in the EU, they're kind of the opposite, where they think more surveillance is bad. So we're very different. We're on the opposite spectrums about how to handle those types of situations. Also, you have to keep in mind that the U.S. versus the EU, our privacy structures are very different. Where in the EU, privacy is considered a fundamental human right and had been their charter since the 1950s, actually. And in the US, privacy is considered a consumer right. So
Hmm.
not every human is a consumer.
Yep.
So there are a lot of gaps in privacy rights in the US because it doesn't rise to that level of a human right. One example I give to this, about let's say about the CCPA in the US. So the CCPA currently is the most comprehensive data privacy law in the US, right? But they also have a lot of exemptions. So let's say you go to a grocery store and they have your data and they sell it, you have rights under the CCPA to get redress. And to be able to say, don't sell my data or whatever. So you go across the street to a church and you don't have that right. So even though they have data about you, they're exempted because they're a non for profit organization, where the EU, they're being a non-for-profit does not exempt you to a great extent, and those privacy laws and rights cover so many different types of other industries and entities.
Yep. So speaking of these rights and these legalities that are sort of penned into legislation and then we're expected to follow it, ag- when I look at situations, not just in North America and the EU, you look at the Middle East for that matter, and heavily influenced by the type of government you have, right? Again, since you do read from the same or you do drink from the same philosophy pool as myself, what we term as democratic in our areas may not necessarily be true to the definition, or maybe they are. I don't know, but if you look at certain autocratic environments, there's very little room to change legislation except as dictated by the authorities that are. How much work do you think needs to happen, or how challenging is it for us to lobby for change when it comes to privacy legislations? It has a lot of impact, not just on citizen engagement, but as you said, it has a lot of impact on the money makers and the people who want to make money. How do you navigate this space of lobbying for change when it comes to privacy regulations?
I think we all have a voice, and we all have to speak out about what we think is right and wrong to be able to make change. But also, I think there's a gap in education. So I feel as though some people aren't as alarmed as they should be about what's happening with their private data just because they're not educated or they don't understand what's happening. So I hear a lot of people say, well, people don't really care about privacy. It's like 'cause people don't really understand what's happening with their privacy. So when you mentioned the movie The Social Dilemma, which I think is a very important film because it makes it very plain to even a teenager, right? What is actually happening to your data. And I don't know anyone who's watched that movie and not come away with maybe more insight and
Yeah.
more, they're more educated. It's like I had no idea that this level of like manipulation was happening. And once you actually open people's eyes to that, they can make better decisions and they can be more educated, and also they can raise their voices. So right now, I feel like the COVID situation, I feel, is bringing privacy more to the forefront because people are sharing more that personal information than they ever had before. So, with these contact tracing apps, people over the world, a lot of them aren't liking to use it, or it's not having the level of uptake as people would want because a lot of people don't really understand or they don't really trust what's happening, not necessarily because of these apps, but because the so much of what has happened beforehand, before now.
Yep. And I think just extending from that social dilemma example that you brought up is often people tend to have this idea that their data is being used to market a product at them, or their data is being used for to drive decision making. And that can have good and bad implications as well. But if we go, for example, to the example in Mexico, I mean, you mentioned Cambridge Analytica, but I'm sure you remember this example of I think it was called the Pena bots. And these were bots that were studying social interactions, and anybody that was against the upcoming or the incumbent leader from Mexico. Then there were bots that were coming up and then tagging those posts with useless hashtags and diverting attention on the pulse of those bots. So it's not just about influencing public opinion; it's also about shaping what you're seeing live and moving your thought process in a certain way. Which takes me to we have about 25 minutes, and I want to cover at least three more areas here. Is there's an aspect of awareness and education. Where does one necessarily start from as an individual? Are there any certifications that you would point them towards? Are there any courses that you would say this is a very good start? Most people will live and swear by privacy by design as a very good starting point, but there's definitely more. What would you recommend to somebody interested in officially going down this path?
Yeah, if so anyone was interested in going down this path professionally, for me, it's just a passion of mine. It's something I've kept up with over the years. Reading the newspaper or reading technology news because technology is so far ahead of the law. Being able to understand the impacts of technology and also, think about the things that you use. Think about your cell phone. Think about the data that it's collecting. Recently, I had to create a Google photo album, which I was not didn't want to do. But so I had to do it for a project. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do it and I'll put these pictures on here and that'll be it. And what I didn't know is that I had it on my phone, and what it was doing was also looking at my camera roll on my phone. It's like, okay, I did not agree to this. Okay. So I had to literally go in and turn that feature off because I did not that's not what I wanted to do. So I think just being an educated, understanding, look up the camera or look up what Alexa is doing. You can find out what Alexa is recording about you. Find out, the toys or whatever, the smart TV that's probably listening to you. Figure out, what's happening around you. So I think being able to be educated about what you're using and being an educated consumer in that way definitely helps. Reading up on things definitely helps. I definitely recommend if people want to get a deep dive, reading books and going to do, take certifications. There are many around. I think PrivSec has a certification. The IAPP has certifications, but really is about understanding how technology interacts with you and whether you agree or like the types of privacy settings or freedoms that you have when you're using technology.
not to sort of animate the whole conversation, but in the words of Walt Disney, right, is the best way to get something done is to stop talking and get doing. And I think there are a lot of templates that you can follow that are out there, and I'm sure that you'll, for those who are watching this live broadcast, you'll be seeing some lower thirds that are playing there. The team at CyberX may also have some templates that you can use to sort of just assess whether one particular tool, you know, is worth your use or not. Now, I am very cautious of the fact that me being the lead on the Cyber Exchange Advisory, a lot of my advisors warn against checkbox security. But to some extent, having a little bit of a checklist at least gets you to know where to divert your attentions to if there is a gap of some sorts. And I've always mentioned the security is not, and even with privacy, it's not about what you have, it's about what you do not have. Let's work a little bit with this aspect of what you do not have. And Debbie, this is going to be a little bit of a targeted, direct question, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless. And I kind of think I know where your response is going to lie, but I'll ask it. And that is this aspect of when a nation is under threat, you mentioned 9/11. At the start of 2020, we had the, for lack of a better word, reduced or privacy can be downplayed for the greater good. I'm hoping you got that question.
Oh, you're cutting out a little bit. You repeat the question. You said about 9/11.
Okay, let's just give it a moment here. Debbie, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So my question was that is there any moment when a nation state is under attack or under threat that you would say that it's okay for privacy to sort of become secondary for the public good?
I do not agree that you need to give up privacy to have security. So I think there was a famous quote by Ben Franklin. It's like people who try to give up privacy for security will have neither. So I think that's kind of a false equivalency to think that you need to give up privacy for security. There are obviously, the state, especially if there's a issue where there is a threat that is, in your country, obviously the state has powers or can have powers at that point that may supersede or override someone's individual privacy for that moment in time. But the problem with that is what tends to happen is that when the threat is sort of gone, those powers tend to remain and even expand. And a lot of times it's like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So you're collecting more data, you're creating more issues where more harm can be created. So an example of this, when I was talking earlier about um, law enforcement doing these warrants about people who are in a certain vicinity. So let's say you go to a coffee shop in this particular vicinity and they have this warrant, and so now law enforcement now has your information from a search engine or phone company, who you are, where you are, and you're sort of caught up in this situation where they're really looking for one person. They're looking for a needle in a haystack, right? But instead
Right.
of looking for finding the needle, they're creating a bigger haystack, and you're in that haystack because you're in that area. But that doesn't mean that you're involved in criminal activity. But so, what do they do with that data? There really is no path. There is no method right now for handling that data because, in theory, if you have probable cause, innocent people should not be involved in criminal investigations. But now they have all this data, and what are they going to do with it? So let's say they find their suspects, have those people. There are no laws that say they have to delete that data. You may become like a known associate with this suspect that you didn't know anything about just because you went to a coffee shop. That is problem. That is a huge problem.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And so let's just unpack that just a little bit more. And I'm hoping you can hear me just fine. So I do
Mhm.
apologize for that little glitch, and you can see me as well.
Yep.
My apologies to all the audience, but I think we're all back up. If we extend that line of thought a little bit, and you brought up that idea of, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you're out there to prosecute, you're going to find or persecute, you're going to find almost every possible area. But let's as we cross the ocean, let's feel the pebbles just a little bit. We often say that, don't let yesterday take up too much of you today. Situations change, so on and so forth. Let's say if we look at outside of the North American context, we take Russia or we take China as an example. In most Pew Research reports, for example, often flagged as some of the most egregious violators when it comes to privacy. Do you necessarily agree that it's those communities that have the most sort of egregious laws around privacy, or is it just the way in which we frame the conversation that makes it look like the North American context is relatively secure and private, but we have some challenges? What's your thought on the global conversation around the politics of privacy?
I think that's interesting. So I think what's the best way I can put this? Uh, I I think any country that does mass surveillance under any circumstance, okay, they're all sort of in one category. So I don't think that even though we don't have a government that is like China, some of the surveillance things that happen here or happen in in Russia are similar. Maybe not to the same extent, but it's something that people need to be concerned about or interested about because you don't know how that data obviously is being used. I think uh, uh, obviously we're all living in a society and we have to conform to the laws of whatever countries that we are living in. But I think that kind of the scope creep of how technology is sort of chipping away at people's individual freedoms and
Yeah.
having that do it in a way that's unchecked is problematic. There was a guy who got arrested. Uh, I don't know, a couple months ago in the US because they had taken his driver's license picture, put it in a database, and then they tried to match it against sort of crime, videos of someone like stealing something from the store. And they arrested this guy and they took him from a judge, and the judge looked at the camera footage and looked at the guy. It's like, this is not the same person, but the computer told him that it was. So he actually was able to get out of that situation. He obviously had to have a lawyer. But what if the police show up at your house and there's an altercation of some sort and you are killed because they made mistakes? It's like, okay, whoops, but you lost your life because of it. So I think understanding, especially if you have live in a country where you have the right to be able to voice your opinion and be able to make change, in a democratic process. I think we need to take those opportunities and not fall back on assuming that someone else is going to protect our own rights.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've heard of the line is that when we sit, stand, and stare, we generate fear. When we act, we generate hope. Which takes me to another question that has come in and allows me to sort of bridge the two together. And that is, and I'll set some context to this, is in the event that I, as an individual consumer or a citizen, am aware that a particular application has breached my privacy. Okay, as many of you are seeing the lower thirds, and I know, Debbie, much of this was shared on your site as well. About 78% of Americans, for example, are not even confident that a company will report a breach to them in the stipulated legal time that they're supposed to report a breach. What do I do when I'm aware of something like this and it's happened? It's myself against a large conglomerate. Are there any support groups in North America that you would recommend? Are there any legal steps that you would tell a person to take to make sure that their individual rights are protected online? Where does someone go for that level of support?
That's a good question. So I think, in the U.S. and maybe I'm sure there are other uh, organizations like this in different countries, but any organization that deals in civil liberties is
Yeah,
probably a good place to go because you as an individual may not have enough power to make those changes, but being able to contact those groups, they know the best ways to, let's say if they have a multitude of people who are having the same complaint, they know how to write to the right representatives or government officials or get the type of publicity that's needed to be able to move the needle in that area. So I think there are a multitude of groups. I don't have any specific ones that I can think of right now, but anything about civil liberties or consumer or human rights issues that happen in your country, those are the people that you should contact, because a lot of times other people are having the same situations that you're having. So being able to have that be represented as a group, I think is very helpful to push the topic.
Fantastic. Einstein said creativity is intelligence having fun. How can you have fun with policy and privacy? And this is again a little bit of a personal question. Comes from me directly, and I see a couple of comments along those. So I'll stitch this in a fun little way. Privacy policies, security policies, whatever have you, these are really intense, data-rich documents, really long, etc. How can you A, have fun with penning a strong privacy policy and get creative with penning your privacy policies? But B, how often do privacy policies get updated, or should they be getting updated? GDPR as an example, or any other policies that you reference.
Yeah. You should be, any company I recommend, you need to be updating your policy, especially when you're bringing in any new technologies
Yeah.
or your new types of customers. So you have new customer base, new technology, that may be a time for you to be able to look at your policy. Also, for the interesting thing for privacy about me, the thing that interests me about privacy is that I can talk about it with businesses, but then I have a stake in it personally. So I'm concerned. I want to know, what are my rights? If I'm using your products, what can I do if I have an issue? So being able to make it personal, like put yourself in the shoes of the consumer or the human that's actually using that product, and to me, it makes it more relatable and it makes it less boring.
Yep. And I want to take that aspect of making it more relatable and working with that a little bit more. So someone like yourself, like we have a lot of listeners who are coming from the private sector, the public sector, seasoned professionals, some students at the graduate level, so on and so forth. And many of them, I hear them talking about this concept of privacy coaches and privacy experts, so on and so forth. Walk us through what someone like yourself does for companies, besides just giving them advice on, this should be reflected in your policy, so on and so forth. Do you help them in the event of a privacy breach? And if so, what are some of the steps that you follow?
Yeah. So I work with companies when they're hair on fire running around. So they've had a breach, something's happened, or I try to advise them before that happens. So I'm really trying to direct the activity. So I'm working with, internal people, external people. Often they bring in external experts on the cybersecurity data side.
Yeah.
Also working with them on messaging to consumers or supervisory authorities if they have breaches. So there's a lot of different things that have to go into play. And as having a data breach is bad enough, but then also having a crisis of confidence within your consumer rate base is a whole other thing. So being able to respond in good ways is really important. I don't know about you, but I've seen some really bad letters that companies have sent out after they had have a breach, and it really kills customer confidence in the company. So you can't send out letters saying like, I'm so sorry that you felt that you were harmed. It's like, wait a minute, I was harmed. So don't try to pussyfoot around the issue. Be able to get straight to the point, like, look, this happened, this is what the steps we're going to take, and different things like that. So that communication is really important, and then also making sure people aren't stepping on anybody's toes. If two people are trying to do the same thing, there's something wrong. So everyone has a little part to play. And you got to make sure that all those roles, people kind of step up into those roles and be able to put the or handle the crisis the best way that they can.
Yeah. And I think this that shift in mindset that you're referring to, right, is that often, what I say this all the time in class as well, is that today's possibilities or today's possible was yesterday's impossible. And this idea of we're going to spend time and understand the situation and then respond. costs a lot of money. Maybe yesterday that was not something you do, but today it is possible with the right kind of coaching and guidance and frameworks. And I really hope our listeners take into account that privacy, whether it's you following the privacy by design principles or you're staying true to a particular legislation, well, there's no one solution fits all. And there's no framework that you just plug and play. There are certain guidelines you can work within. There are certain parameters within which you can build a robust enough policy statement. And as Bill Harmer from Secure Auth always says, you're never going to be 100% secure, 100% private. You're just going to consistently lower the level of risk and build the level of confidence. And I think there should be no illusions about what an expert like Debbie can bring to the table and how you need to be prepared for not if, but when that moment happens. We have another 10 minutes. So I'm going to go into two more questions and then we'll come to a bit of a soft landing and a conclusion. And the question that's here is I don't know how much this relates to your work, but it is quite intriguing to me at least. And I'll give it my 2 rupees of thought as well. And that is this question of the role of insurance. Cyber insurance is taking up quite a lot of interest amongst firms. How does a privacy breach get reflected in the insurance policy that you may have?
Good question. So, not all cyber insurance policies are created the same. Obviously, they're different in premiums. They're different in coverage. Let's say you have a cyber breach, and you have a cyber policy, and it's found through an investigation that the reason why you have a breach is that you didn't patch your servers. You may get nothing or very little based on that, because some of these are basic hygiene things that people need to have. So what I think is going to happen with insurance, I think the market is going to tighten up a bit, because some people are having breaches because of things that they could have prevented, and then also, not all cyber policies are created the same. So you may have a cyber policy, but you need to really read and understand like what it covers, what your deductibles are. If they're going to have any post help with you on, like, publicity. If they're going to help you with finding a team of people who are going to help, sort of plug the hole and be able to get you back to where you are, especially in a ransomware attack. That's a big issue, because they're actually in the US, they're trying to pass something, or they have passed a rule saying that you shouldn't pay ransom. And we know for sure that people pay ransom, right? Because it's not a great, no one wants to pay ransom. Like, I don't see any, there's never been a movie where someone said, oh my God, I can't wait to pay ransom. Nobody wants to do that. So you want to make the best decision that you can, but it's an option, unfortunately, that has to be on the table until you can take it off the table. And I think having a better cybersecurity stance to begin with, and not, I think some people think it can't happen to them, and that's
Yeah.
not true. So, and I think some people, unfortunately, have thought, well, I don't really need to look into cyber or invest in it because I have a cyber insurance policy. And
Yeah.
some of those people, if they have a breach, they go out of business. So you
Yeah.
definitely don't want to be one of those people.
Absolutely. And I think it's also crucial for folks to understand is a lot of insurance sometimes gets driven by the fear, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be driven by that, right? It's the more you know about where you can possibly have a leak or where you can possibly have a gap, you get the right equipment or the right tools in order to protect you in that event that you cannot deal with it right away or that it has an impact. And I don't like to distance how we think about home insurance and how we think about cyber insurance at the same time. And I think if you see the parallels very closely, you'll begin to see why these are important. I'll take one more question and then we'll come towards the closing. And of course, I expected this to happen, and that is with regards to the new normal and the realities of COVID. As you may be aware, in the Canadian context, we do have a contact tracing app, and there was quite a lot of discussion around what are the policies and the framework, so on and so forth. I'd like to get your opinion on the privacy issues that come with the contact tracing apps within our current climate.
Good question. So, my opinion in general is that contact tracing is a profession. It's not an app.
Yeah.
So even though people have apps and they may be helpful, it doesn't really square the circle, right? It doesn't really cover everything that needs to be covered. Also, I'll say something only 45% of people in the world have smartphones.
Yeah,
So these apps only work on smartphones. So that means the majority of people in the world that may need contact tracing aren't using these tools. So it's only I mean, I don't begrudge anyone who wants to use them. I personally decide not to use them, especially again because we have a private healthcare system in the US where if you have a public if you have universal healthcare, you aren't concerned about being tossed off of healthcare because you're using a contact tracing app or someone having a pre-existing condition, where we in the US have those concerns. And also I think I would like to see that data about anything medical stay within a patient provider situation. Also, back to the analogy I was trying to give about the warrant where you're the geofence warrants where you're collecting information from people in a particular vicinity. I feel like the technology doesn't provide uh, context. So
right.
let's say me and you live in an apartment next to each other, and you're on the other side of the wall, and then we're literally 6 feet apart or closer to 6 feet or something. And the contact tracing act say, well, you're near this person. And you're like, no, I wasn't. Like this, you know what I'm saying? There's no way for you to know that. Or if I'm at a stoplight and I'm in my car and then you're at a corner and we're close together, we're not in contact. So I think you have to take all that with a grain of salt because again, the technology can't provide context in the same way that a human could. So being able to talk with a human about those issues is really important.
Fantastic. Now I've got a couple of more questions that have come in, and I'm just going to pick on one very quickly, because I know that's typically the one that I like to close with. For the others that are out there, please feel free to drop them in the Cyber Exchange wall, and we'll definitely respond to them, or send them to me or Debbie directly, and we'll definitely connect with you on that. And that is, what reading is to the mind, what exercise is to the body. How do you keep fresh with all of the different ideas that are out there, all of the different situations? What's a book that you would recommend for, in this case, an aspiring expert in the world of privacy?
That's a good question. So I do really like the uh what is it? Susanna Zubnoff. She was in uh the movie The Social Dilemma,
Right?
um, Surveillance Capitalism. That was a
Yes.
pretty good. That was a pretty good book because surveillance is an issue all over the world. So this is something I think everybody can relate to. And I think when we think about surveillance, we think about like a movie with someone with binoculars or some satellite looking at you. Even though that's true in some regards, but I mean, you don't when you think of surveillance, you don't think about your smart speaker
Yeah.
or your TV. Or all of your phone is listening to things that you're saying even though you're not interacting with the phone. Like we're not thinking about that. So I think it's interesting to see how that ties together, especially because it's a moneymaker for
Yeah.
companies because they can get those devices into your home and the data that they capture can be sold in certain circumstances. So I think that's a good one. I
Absolutely.
and then also, just I would recommend if you're interested in privacy, put like a Google alert or something that
Yeah.
it sends you something every day so that you can read a bit about it. I do a ton of research in reading. I do several hours. I have done several hours a day for over 20 years on this topic. So, it to me is very fascinating, and especially as technology continues to grow, it's just the privacy. There are privacy issues that there are not laws made yet to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that I always tell everyone in this world of security and privacy as we come to our concluding remarks is it's fine to be dealing with one problem or one aspect at a time. And those are the good leaders who spend that one problem, go through it, find a solution, and spend time until they've perfected or they've corrected whatever it is that they're looking at. And one of the things that I learned from you, Debbie, today was this aspect of it's indeed you're a very smart individual, but more that you spend time with the problem. You spend more time than most people would in order to come to that effective solution. And good reading, good resources, and as Danny Pahar. who at our last session also said, having those Google alerts, you may not read the whole article, but skimming through it, getting those key nuggets of information set you up for success and set you up in a differentiated path altogether. Debbie, I'm about to make my concluding remarks, but before I do that, I want to thank Maddie Raza for putting us in touch together. I followed your work, as you could probably tell, quite a bit. I was a major fan of it, and I still am, of everything that you do. So it's quite the honor and quite humbling for me to have you, Debbie. And to our audience, what I will say before I ask Debbie to say goodbye, you've learned a lot around aspects of privacy. You learned about the social political elements of it. You learned about the ethical side of it. You learned about the business return on investment when it comes to privacy. And I hope you've got an optic into the life of a privacy expert, which is not just about reading policy, but really knowing about context. I've said this repeatedly: privacy doesn't operate in a vacuum, and it's your responsibility to know what that context is. For all those of you who are interested, you can get in touch with Debbie Reynolds on cyberexchange.ca. And what I will tell you is that in my 55 odd minute conversation with her, if I can quote Harry Potter, is if you really want to know the true value or the true meaning of a person, don't look at how they treat their equals. Look at how they treat their inferiors. Someone like myself, who is much more inferior to her in the world of privacy, she's treated me with a lot of respect, a lot of kindness, and a lot of openness. And I really appreciate that, Debbie. Debbie, I'm going to see you in the green room, so I'm going to ask you to stay, but I'm going to turn it over to you just to say a thank you comment, and then we'll close. Debbie?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I love to talk, especially people from Canada, because you guys are great. And I know you complain about your privacy law, but we wish we had a law like that in the U.S. But I'm really happy to have these conversations. It's important because privacy impacts all of us. I feel like we need to be able to talk to someone who's 80 and someone who's 8 about stuff like this, and not just in university forums and things like that. It has to be as common as air, privacy. So I feel like, because that's all of our human rights, it's very important to have these types of exchanges.
And with that, I want to thank you, Debbie, and get everybody to put that on a shirt that privacy is a human right. On Friday, we'll be joined by Dr. Ali from the University of Guelph from the Cybersecurity Science Lab up at the University of Guelph, and I look forward to seeing all of you there. Debbie, I'll see you in the green room. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on Friday. Take care.